Hello everyone and welcome to another video about AP Economics. This is Unit 1, Module 4. We're going to carry on Module 1. We talked about some basic terminology of economics, the 10 principles of economics, and scarcity and opportunity costs, and choices, and thinking marginally and rationally and positive and normative statements. Module 2, we talked about a model of the business cycle and the business cycle in Module 2. In Module 3, we talked about the circular flow chart and introduced the basic idea of a production possibility frontier and the model of that production possibility curve or frontier, and talked about, it showed us the opportunity cost and the shifting or moving of the curve for growth and innovation and changes in technology. So we're going to build upon that. So if you remember this here, the production possibility frontier that we talked about before, we said that we were going to make some assumptions that we're only going to produce two goods, right? Two goods, and we're going to hold our resources like land, labor, capital, raw materials fixed. We're going to hold our technology fixed. We're going to say that we're at full employment. And this is if we're going to make two products, consumer goods and capital goods, this would be the basic production possibility frontier. And we said anywhere on this line, whether it's point A, B, C, if we put down here a spot on the bottom here, a spot up here, anywhere on that line is the most efficient. All right, to go from point A to point B, we said that we had to make more consumer goods, we had to give up some capital goods, right? Because those are the two goods on the X and Y coordinates. And to go from B to A, we'd have to make more capital goods, we'd have to give up some consumer goods. So that our trade-off is capital goods, consumer goods. Now, I don't have numbers on here to do the actual opportunity cost, but we know we're going to be giving up items. We know point D is inefficient, right? We're not using our resources wisely, or we have some sort of unemployment. And given that all this stuff here is fixed, E is unattainable. E is unattainable. Now, what we do know is we would like to have the curve shift outward, right? We want the curve to shift outward to show growth. We know that if we built a little more capital goods in this example, if we built more capital goods now, we would have greater growth in the future of consumer goods, and things would be better. Sometimes just innovations in one good. So we might see if just there's an innovation in consumer goods, we would see something like this. All right. We know when we have the curve like this, we typically have an increase in opportunity cost. If we had a straight line, so if like our curve was perfectly straight, then we know that's probably a constant opportunity cost. So these are all things that we talked about on the previous video, but we're going to go beyond that now. We're gonna use this model and how we looked at the numbers and looked at just the points without the graph. We're going to build upon that now in Module 4. So this is going to be a little bit longer video. We're going to talk about trade now, how it can lead to improvements for individuals and the economy that realistically that we can consume outside of our production possibility curve. So if we go back and we look here, we're saying that it is possible if two countries or two firms specialize in trade that we might be able to consume at point E, even though we can't produce out there by point E. So that is possible. So we have to look at whether a firm has absolute or comparative advantage. So we're going to learn the difference between absolute and comparative advantage, and then we're going to look at how comparative advantage leads to trade. So we're going to do all that in this video. So we want to specialize in trade. So the question we're going to ask ourselves, why do people trade? Why do people trade? Why do we trade things? And if we think of, like, let's say sports, they trade players to try to make their team better. Well, if we think globally, countries trade finished goods or raw materials of some sort to other countries that may not have that product in order to make the citizens of that particular country better off, to have growth so that the standard of living rises. That's really what we're looking at. So when we assume, why do people trade? Assume people didn't trade, what things would you have, or what things would you have to go without? Well, everything you don't produce yourself. So if there's no trade, like if we think about today, all the technology that we might get that's made from another country, if we didn't make it here in America, we wouldn't have it, right? Clothes, cell phone, bananas, certain healthcare medicines. So the point, everyone specializes in production of some good and service to trade with others, right? We want to do that, right? We need to have that. Another reason why we trade. What would life be like if people in cities couldn't trade with people in other cities, or people in states couldn't trade with other people in states? What would happen then? Well, we'd have limited trade, limited choices. People's standard of living would be worse off, right? The point being, more access to trade means more choices and a higher standard of living. We like that. We want to do that. We want to have that growth. So we're going to take a look, and we're going to try to calculate and learn what absolute and comparative advantage are. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that. Now, to give you kind of an example of comparative and absolute advantage, if we were to take, I don't know, let's say we take a big bodybuilding guy, and we take a really small person, in stature, much smaller person, and we just said, who's stronger? We're all going to jump and look at the muscle bound guy and go, man, he's stronger, right? So if we put both of them on a bench to lift and bench press weights, the guy who's bigger and looks like he works out and is bulky, and the powerlifting kind of guy, he's going to maybe lift more in a bench. Let's say he benches 500, but he weighs 300. The other guy weighs 100, but benches 225. Well, you could say in absolute strength, the muscle bound guy who benches more, he's stronger. He has absolute advantage in overall strength. But if we look at comparative advantage, we're looking at per pound. Then we could say, like, how much, if we look at body weight versus how much they lift, the little guy might actually have comparative advantage. Per pound, he may be stronger. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, like, overall, like, who makes the most, and then we're going to look at who, in comparative advantage, who gives up the least. So so when we look at this, when we think of this comparative and absolute advantage, per unit opportunity cost, what we want to do is we want to look at what is it you're giving up, right, to produce a product. And whoever gives up the least is the one who is best at producing that product. Okay. So if we said the per unit output cost is the opportunity cost divided by the units gained. So assume it costs $50 to produce 5 t-shirts. What is your per unit cost for each shirt? Your per unit cost, it's $10 per shirt. Now, take that money out of the equation, and instead of producing 5 shirts, you could have made 10 hats, right? So you could have made 10 hats. So instead of making 5 shirts, you could have made 10 hats with that same amount. So, what is your per unit output for each shirt in terms of hats given up? Well, if that's the case, for one shirt, you could have produced 2 hats. So instead of 5 shirts, we could have made 10 hats. So therefore, the per unit, one shirt costs us 2 hats. That is, so the trade-off is shirts or hats. The opportunity cost to make one shirt is 2 hats. Okay. So, what is your per unit output cost for each hat in terms of given shirts? Well, now we essentially do the inverse. If one shirt costs two hats, then for one hat, it costs a half a shirt. Okay. So that is calculating opportunity costs. Now, here we're not giving it, let's say, the dollars, we're giving it, we're talking about the cost to one shirt in terms of hats, and what does it cost for one hat in terms of shirts to see what you have to give up. What your next best alternative is of producing a product. So if we look, Ronald McDonald can produce 20 pizzas or 200 burgers. Papa John's can produce 100 pizzas or 200 burgers. So that's they can. So what we're saying in this example is Ronald McDonald could produce all pizzas and just make 20, or he can produce all burgers and just make 200. Papa John's could produce 100 pizzas or 200 burgers. Now, if we say that they have a constant opportunity cost and we split it in half, we could say Ronald McDonald could make 10 pizzas and 100 burgers. We could say Papa John's could produce 50 pizzas and 100 burgers, right? At the same time, that would be a point on the given line. So when we go ahead and we look at opportunity costs, so it says, what is Ronald McDonald's opportunity cost for one pizza in terms of burgers? To make one pizza, what does he have to give up, right? What does he have to give up? So when we think of that, for one pizza, it's going to cost 10 burgers for Ronald McDonald. Then it says for Ronald McDonald, what's his opportunity cost for one burger in terms of pizza? Okay, this is output, right? This is output. We're talking about output here. And so all we have to do once we have that one pizza costs 10 burgers, because all we did was reduce it down to what one, 20 to 200, a ratio, 20 to 200 burgers. So we reduce it down to one, and that's where we got the 10 burgers. So we would just do the inverse. So the inverse of that would be one burger cost 1/10 of a pizza. Okay. Now, if we go ahead and we do the same thing for Papa John's for one cost for one pizza to find one pizza, we would then say it would cost him two burgers, right? So this is we're using an idea of output and for calculating output opportunity costs. I'm going to write it down here real small. It's OOO when we do output, other over. All right. So if we want to know how much it costs to make one burger, we go other over, right? The other product's number over. So we'll do some more examples of that as we go through. So then, if we want to figure out then what is Papa John's opportunity cost for one burger, we're going to take the inverse. We can take the inverse of that, and well, one burger costs one half pizza. Now, here is the thing here if we look at this and we are looking at, let's say, absolute advantage, who just makes more pizzas or has the ability to make more pizzas? Papa John's. He makes 100 pizzas to Ronald McDonald's 20 pizzas. When it comes to burgers, they both make 200. So neither one of them have an absolute advantage. They make the same. But let's look at comparative advantage. Who gives up the least? Who gives up the least? And if we look in terms of pizza, Papa John to make one pizza, it cost him two burgers. For Ronald McDonald to make one pizza, it cost him 10 burgers. So who gives up the least? Well, in pizzas, that is Papa John's. But let's look at burgers now. Ronald McDonald to make one burger, he only gives up 1/10 of a pizza. And for Papa John to make one burger, he gives up one half of a pizza. Well, 1/10 is less than one half. So we can essentially say then that Ronald McDonald's has comparative advantage, right? Ronald McDonald has comparative advantage in producing burgers because it cost him the least. It cost him 1/10 to Papa John's 1/2. But Papa John has comparative advantage in producing pizza because for Papa John, one pizza costs him 2 burgers, but for Ronald McDonald, one pizza costs 10 burgers. So if they were going to specialize and trade, if they were going to specialize and trade, Ronald McDonald would make burgers. Ronald McDonald would make burgers, and Papa John's would make pizza. I mean, that's kind of given this example. Okay. So once again, if we wanted to define these, if we wanted to define these, absolute advantage is the producer who can produce the most output or requires the least amount of inputs. They make the most. So we said before, Papa John's had absolute advantage in pizzas because he can produce 100 to Ronald McDonald's 20. Okay. But neither one of them had absolute advantage in burgers because they both produce 200. But then we look at comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is whoever has the lowest opportunity cost, whoever gives up the least. So Ronald McDonald's has comparative advantage in burgers because it cost him the lowest per unit opportunity cost, right? That was 1/10, where um, where I believe it was 1/2 of a burger. So it was, I believe, for Ronald McDonald make one burger, it was 1/10 of a pizza, and the Papa John's for one burger, it was 1/2. I'd have to go back a page. I can't remember exactly. But countries essentially do the same thing. They look at who has the comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is nice. Don't get me wrong, absolute advantage is nice, but we want to use comparative advantage all the time. So whenever we talk about trade, we always want to use comparative advantage, right? So we should specialize on the good that is cheaper. And what we mean by cheaper, the country that has a comparative advantage that gives up the least to make a product. So let's take a look here. Given these numbers, so we have the US and we have Brazil, okay? They make wheat and sugar. And these are their numbers. These are their numbers. And so they can be anywhere on these lines, anywhere, any points on these lines they can produce. But we're just saying if the United States just made sugar, or if they just made wheat, or if Brazil just made sugar or just made wheat. All right, that's what we're doing. We're looking at these are the numbers that we're getting up here. Okay, this is what we're doing. Okay, so we could see when it comes to something as simple as absolute advantage, we could say that the U.S. has absolute advantage in both. Right? They produce more wheat than Brazil. They produce more sugar than Brazil. But we don't want to use absolute advantage. We want to use comparative advantage. So essentially, it's a we want to look at the ratio. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the ratio. So we know that for the U.S. to produce, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. But another way to do this, because this is output, and we're going to use the acronym if you've read in your resource guide. For output, we're going to use OOO, and for inputs, we're going to use IOU. But for output, we're going to use other over, right? Other over. So other over means we're going to take other over. So 30 over. So to make one wheat, 30 over 30 is 1, right? And then over here, we do the same thing to make one sugar, right? To make one sugar, it'd be other 30 over 30, which would be then 1. So that would be the opportunity costs for that, right? One sugar costs one wheat. It's a concentrate. Now, if we look at Brazil, if we use other over to make one wheat, we would put 20 over 10. So that should be 2, right? For one wheat, it costs 2 sugars. Now, we could do other over, which would be for sugar. For one sugar, other over, so 10 over 20 is 1/2. or we could just use the reciprocal of 2. Okay, so one sugar costs one half wheat. Okay, so that's the basic thing that we have here. Okay, this is the basic idea of what we'd want to do. Now, once we're at this point, we have to ask ourselves, which country has comparative advantage in wheat? Who's better at making wheat? Who's better at making wheat? Well, it looks like the United States has comparative advantage in wheat because it only costs them one sugar, where Brazil, it costs them two sugar. Now, what will always happen is once we find one comparative advantage, then we automatically know that if the United States has comparative advantage in wheat, that the other country or the other company will have comparative advantage in the other product. And we see that over here when it comes to sugar. When we look at sugar, we could see that Brazil, for one sugar, costs them a half a wheat, but for the United States, one sugar costs them one wheat. So if we were going to specialize in trade, if we were going to specialize in trade, the United States would make wheat and Brazil would make sugar. And then they would trade. Okay. So here we go. There is a specialization in wheat. Okay. And there is a specialization or the comparative advantage in sugar. Okay. So, which country should export sugar? Which country should export wheat? Which country should import wheat? Okay. So, if we look, if we're going to specialize in trade, if which country should export sugar, it should be the country that's making sugar, all right, that is going to specialize who's better at making sugar. So, Brazil is going to export sugar and America is going to then import sugar. Then it says which country should export wheat? Well, America is better at making wheat, so they're going to produce it and they're going to export it. Therefore, Brazil is going to import it. They're going to import it. Okay? So, the question becomes now, where where should we be? Where should we be? So if this is our graph now, okay, this is our graph, okay, and we know that let's say if they split, and these were the numbers of sugar and wheat, their productions of sugar and wheat, um, and where they're at, and we go ahead and we look, if the US specializes only in wheat, right? So that means that they would be, let me use a different color than red. If they're going to only specialize in wheat, they're going to make wheat right here. So they're going to specialize in wheat. And we know Brazil is only going to make sugar. So they're going to be right here. They're going to specialize there. So now the question is, let's specialize in trade. Okay, let's specialize in trade. So then the question becomes, well, what's a good trade ratio that would benefit them both? And we're going to go into that, but if we go back, let me go back here. So what we want to do, if we're talking in trade for terms of wheat, all right, if we're looking at trading wheat for sugar, okay, we want to essentially the United States wants to receive more than one sugar, right? Because it costs them to make one sugar. So they want something more than one sugar in return. And if it costs more than two for Brazil, they're losing out because they don't want it to cost more for them. So we should trade something in between these two. Or if we're talking about, like, if we're going to say one sugar for something, we would want to trade something in between this. So that's kind of how we work on it. And we'll go over some samples and we'll practice it. So if we're going to specialize in trade, okay, if we're going to specialize in trade, then if we're going to go ahead and trade one wheat for one and a half sugar. So if we go back, to that one. See that we trade 1 wheat for 1.5 sugar. Let's go back to the previous slide. If we go back to the previous slide, didn't we want to trade for 1 wheat in between 1 sugar, which would make us better off because that's what it costs us already. So we want to get more because we're specializing it. And Brazil, they want to spend less on it essentially, so it wants to be in here. Now, if we would have turned it around and said, "Hey, for 1 sugar, what would we trade 1 sugar for?" We would have to do something in between 1 wheat and 1.5 wheat. So if we said 1 sugar for 3/4 of a wheat, okay, that would be something that we would be interested in. But here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to trade 1 wheat for 1.5 sugars. So what happens is for every wheat that we give up, so if we look here on the left hand side, if we produce 1 wheat or 30 wheats and we go ahead and we trade one, then we're going to get 1.5 sugars in return. So for every wheat that we're giving up, we're getting an additional 1.5 of sugar. Okay. So this essentially makes a new plot point. Just as if we go over here, for every 1.5 in Brazil, if they give up 1.5 sugars, so that takes them from 20 to 18.5. Now, remember, they're making sugar, Brazil's making. So when we think about this spot right here, that's this spot right here. And when we think of this spot, that is this spot right there. And when we're talking about what we're going to trade. So we're making 30, the US is making 30 wheats and Brazil is making 20 sugars. And we're talking about this trade ratio that's up here on the top, 1 wheat for 1.5 sugars. So if Brazil trades, they trade every time they trade 1.5 sugars, they're going to get 1 wheat. Another 1.5 they trade, they get 2 wheats, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so this can actually now we could create a trade consumption possibility curve based upon these numbers. So we can make a deal. We could essentially say, hey, we're going to trade at the end of the day. We're going to trade since it's a one wheat to 1.5 sugar. The US is going to keep 20, right? They're going to keep 20. So they're going to trade 20 wheats for 15 sugars because here they started with 20 and they're down to 5, but they got the 10 wheats. So if we were to graph that, now the US, they'll be at 20, but they'll be at 15. So they'll be able to, wheat's on the bottom, right? Yeah. They'll be able to consume out here. And for Brazil, if they were at 5, they'll be able to consume out here. So if you take a look after trade, this little part right here is the consumption curve that they could get for the trade. That makes everything better off. Now, this line stops here because Brazil they can't trade anymore. That would essentially them giving up all of their sugar, right? They're not going to trade any more of that. But essentially, we could decide on a spot and trade, and we would be somewhere out here. And that's good. That means that overall, we're better off than we were before. Okay, we're better off than we were before. Okay, so this trade shifts the production possibility curve, or we could say the consumption possibilities with trade. We're able to consume more with trade. Now, let's take a look at this example right here. Now, in the book, in your resource booklet, I'm not sure which. Let me find the page here for this. Oh gosh, where is it? I had it open. So if you're in my AP Econ class in 2020, 2021 school year, we're talking about pages 52 and 53 of the resource book. and it talks about this thing called OOO and IOU. And this is how we're going to calculate things. So let's take a look using the output method, and OOO is the output method. Okay, so the following chart illustrates the number of CDs and pounds of beef that can be produced in 1 hour. So this is output per 1 hour. So it says which nation has the absolute advantage in CDs? So who makes more CDs? Well, if you look, they both Japan and Canada both make 4 CDs. So in an hour, so neither one of them have an absolute advantage. Neither one, right? Neither. I'll put an N there. Which nation has absolute advantage in producing beef? Well, let's take a look. Oh, looky. Canada produces 6 pounds in an hour, where Japan only produces 2 in an hour. So here, Canada has absolute advantage. Now it wants you to calculate who has comparative advantage. Okay, comparative advantage. So up in the right-hand corner, I'm going to look at Japan. Okay, so for Japan to produce one CD. So we do output, other, over. So this is output, other, over. So to make 1 CD, we're going to do other, over. So 2/4 gives us, to make 1 CD, it costs us a half of beef. Okay, 2/4 is 1/2. So then we know for Japan, then the reciprocal of that, to make 1 beef, then, right? Now we could do other, over. So if we were going to say what does it cost of 1 beef, we could say 4/2. But we know it's also the reciprocal, which is 2 CDs. Okay, so that's Japan. Let me use a different color for Canada. So we'll use Canada up here. So for Canada, for 1 CD, we say other, over. So 6/4, which is what? 3/2, right? Which is 3/2 of beef. And then for 1 beef, then we could use the reciprocal, or we could just go 4/, because it's other, over 4/6, which is 2/3 CDs. Now it says, so we calculate the opportunity, we calculate the opportunity cost. So let's use a different color now. Let's use black here. So now it says calculate the comparative advantage for CDs. Which has comparative advantage of CDs? So if we look at CDs here, CDs here, who's giving up the least when it comes to CDs? Japan gives up 1/2 of beef, and Canada gives up 2/3 of beef. Well, 2/3 is greater. So who has comparative advantage in CDs? That's Japan. Now it says who has comparative advantage in producing beef. Well, if we know Japan has it in um, in CDs, okay, then we should know that um, the other, so then we should know the other country should have, but we'll go ahead and we'll compare. So beef here to beef here. So Japan, for beef, it costs them 2 CDs, and for Canada, beef costs them 2/3 of a CD, 2/3 of a CD. So we know that Canada is better at making beef. So that would be Canada. So it says, should Japan specialize in beef, CDs, or beef? Well, Japan should specialize in producing CDs, and Canada should specialize in beef. They should specialize in trade. Now, if we were thinking of a ratio, all right, the ratio would have to be something. If we were going to go for like CDs, for every 1 CD, what should we trade it for? Well, let's look. If Japan is specializing in CDs, it costs them 1/2 of a beef. But for Canada, it costs them 3/2 of a beef. Well, we know Japan is specializing in that. So the area, they have to be willing to trade somewhere between greater than a half of beef, but less than three halves of a beef. So really, one CD for one beef would be a fair trade. So realistically, if you were to draw it out, if I were to say a trade ratio, you would have to say something like um, let's see. If you drew it out, it'd be like one half beef, right? It would have to be greater than or equal to one CD, but less than or equal to what is that? Three halves of a beef. So if I asked you for a beef, what would the trade ratio have to be? It'd have to be something in that. So for one CD, you have to be willing to trade between a half of a beef and three halves of a beef, and then they'll both be better off. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't trade in that little parameter, then one of the countries is actually going to be worse off with trade. So if you want them both to be good, you'd have to do that. Now, if we wanted to do it for like one beef, it would have to be some sort of trade ratio between for one beef, it would have to be between two and two thirds. So something between two thirds. So it'd have to be greater than or less than that, or between that and two. So for CDs, so for one beef, it would have to be either between two thirds of a CD or two of a CD. It'd have to be somewhere in between that ratio. So you could say one beef for one CD. Okay. Now let's take a look. This is another one, but this one is input instead. This is input. Okay. And input, we go input other under IOU. Input is other under. Okay. So this one says the following chart illustrates the number of hours it takes to produce one loaf of bread and one bushel of corn. So this is the amount of hours needed to make one loaf of bread or one loaf of or one bushel of corn. Okay, so realistically, who is putting the amount of work in? So now you have to think a little bit differently now because this is input hours. Okay. So when we think about which nation has absolute advantage in producing bread, so then you have to look at bread, and this is a little different. For bread, well, let's look. Both countries have to put in 4 hours. So neither of them have absolute advantage. But now we look at who has absolute advantage in corn. Well, who essentially uses the essentially the least amount to produce a bushel of corn. So that absolute advantage would then go to the United States of America because they only need two labor hours to make one bushel of corn, where France it takes 6 labor hours to make one bushel of corn. So absolute advantage would be for the U.S. because they use the least amount of resources to get that. Okay. Now, when we did output method and we looked at absolute advantage, we looked at who could just produce the most. Well, let's say we gave this in a 12-hour work schedule, a 12-hour work schedule. The United States in 12 hours can make 6 bushels, where France could only make 2 bushels. So, in overall output, the United States would have absolute advantage. But now we're going to take a look at comparative advantage. Who gives up the least? So this is where it's a little bit different. So if we go USA up here and we go to make one bread, Now this is input, so it's other under. So for bread for the United States, other under, other under. So 4 halves, right? 4/2, other under. So to make one bread, they're giving up two, right? They're giving up 2 corns, right? So in the same time the United States can make one loaf of bread, they could have made 2 bushels of corn. So then we could do the inverse of that for one corn, or we could do the input other under. So input other under. So we want to know how much does it make to make one corn. other unders. So 4, so it'd be 2/4. So that would be 1/2 bread. Okay, so that's the United States. Now, I'll pick a different color for France. France, to make one bread, for one bread, for one bread, other unders, so that would be 4/6. So that would be 2/3 of a corn. And to make one corn, we could do the reciprocal here, or we could just say for one corn, other under. So 6/4 is 3/2 bread. So now it says which country has comparative advantage in producing bread. So if we compare bread here to bread here, who gives up the least in making bread? That would be France. They give up the least in making bread. So they should specialize in bread. They should export bread. Well, then who is better at making corn? Well, for the US, for one corn, it costs a half of a loaf of bread. For France, one corn costs them 3/2 of a bread. So therefore, the United States is better at making corn. Oop, I should not corn there. That should be US. My bad. Okay. So now the US should specialize in producing corn and export that. So the US would export corn to France, and France would export bread to the United States. Okay. Now, the ratio would be, if you want to pause it and try to come up with the ratio, that would be awesome. But I'm going to do for one bread, what would be a good ratio for bread? Bread should be somewhere between a positive ratio that they both will be successful and be able to consume outside their production possibility curve, would be somewhere between 2/3 and 2. Somewhere between 2/3 and 2. Now, the closer it is to 2/3, or the closer it is to 2, if it's going to benefit one country more than another. So we could say something like, one bread for 1 1/3 corn, or we could say one bread for one corn. All right, but anything in between the 2/3 and the 2. Okay, for one corn, if we were going to look at one corn, it would have to be somewhere between 3/2 and 1/2. So somewhere in there. So that might be 3/4. So we could say something like one corn for 3/4 of a bread. For one bread, we could say something like one corn. I mean, anything in those, and we could reverse these. One for one, like. But you have a parameter. You have a margin of error that they both will be positive. But this is what negotiation. This is why countries negotiate trade deals to try to get more trade favorable for them. They're not so worried about being favorable for the other country, and that's why foreign policy, that's a big deal. Okay. So we're always looking at terms of trade, terms of trade. Okay. So both countries can benefit from trade if they each have relatively lower opportunity costs, and the term of trade benefits them both. For example, we look at that one with the United States and Brazil, and that was 1 ton of wheat for 1.5 tons of sugar. So a 1 to 1.5, one wheat to 1.5 tons of sugar. So that would make them both better off. So let's take a look at this one. So if we take a look, there's several questions here. So if we take a look here, okay, we take a look and we have Kenya and India, and we have the numbers. Now we could put this on a graph. If we were to put this on a graph and we put, if this was Kenya, we could put 30 here and 10 here, and there's the pineapples radios, right? We're just going to draw a straight line, because those are the only numbers we have. They don't give us any other data to give us kind of that that bowed outward production possibility frontier. So if we take a look here in general, who has absolute advantage in radios? Who has absolute advantage in radios? Um, and if we look, who just produces more radios? And if we look, India produces more radios. Okay. Oops. India produces more radios, right? India, for them, they produce more radios. So we'll put India here. Then it says, what is the cost of one radio for India? Well, this is output. This is output. This is output. So we would use OOO, right? It says, what does it cost for one radio? So if we want to find what one radio would be, for one radio, it would be other over. So that'd be 40 over 40, which is just one. So for one radio, it would be one pineapple. So the cost of one radio is one pineapple. Okay. What is the per unit opportunity cost for one pineapple in Kenya? Well, to find one pineapple in Kenya, okay, for one pineapple in Kenya, this is output. So other over, right? Other over. So for one pineapple, that would be 1/3. So 10 over 30. Output other over. So 1/3. So that would be 10 over 30, right? Which is one third radios. So then over here, this would be for one radio, it would be 3 pineapples, and this would still be one pineapple is equal to one radio. Okay, so then it says who has comparative advantage. Well, if we take a look, who has comparative advantage in pineapples? Who's better at making pineapples? Kenya is better at making pineapples. They give up the least. Who has comparative advantage in radios? Well, that would be India. They're better at making radios. So who should import? You got to be careful of questions. They might ask who should import or export. Well, if we know that Kenya is going to, they're going to specialize, they have comparative advantage and they're going to specialize in pineapples, then that means they're going to export pineapples. Therefore, India would be importing them, right? Okay. And then we know that if they specialize there, then we know for radios, India is going to specialize in radios. So now the question 7 says, trading one radio, how many pineapples would benefit both countries? So if we're going to do one radio for pineapples, it would have to be something between one pineapple. It has to be greater than one pineapple, but less than 3 pineapples, somewhere in there. Okay. Now, here's the other thing, too. This example has the countries on the left and the products on the top. Sometimes it'll be opposite. It will have the products on the left and the countries on the top. So you have to clearly read the chart to make sure you don't screw that up. Okay, always know where your countries are or the companies are and the products are. So don't let that screw you up a little bit, okay? Because I think the ones we've shown have always showed the countries on the left and then the products on the top. But anything between 1 and 3 pineapples, so we could just say uh, one radio for, it's got to be greater than one. So let's say 2 pineapples, and that would benefit both countries. Both countries would be better off. Okay, both countries would be better off. So if we take a look, I actually think I did all the math on the next one. Yep, I did. So um, there's that math that we already went over. Okay, we already said that Kenya has comparative advantage in pineapples, and India has comparative advantage in radios. Kenya wants radios, right? So in terms of trade, Kenya wants one radio. So one radio is greater than 3 for them. Okay, so is greater than 3 pineapples, then Kenya is worse off and should make radios on their own. So that trade, India wants pineapples, but they don't want to. They want the cost to be less for them. So what would be a good terms of trade? And I believe we had given one before. So here, anything if we go with terms of trade that would benefit them both. So if we said for one pineapple, what would make them both better off? For one pineapple, it would have to be for radios. It would have to be between 1/3 radio and one radio. So for pineapples, we could say 1/2 of a radio. That would be a good one. Or if we wanted to speak in turn, now we could do the reciprocal of this for the other. So we could literally turn this around and go one radio for two pineapples, which would be a good trade ratio here too. So one radio in between 1 and 3 would be a good trade ratio. But anywhere in that, you could do one radio for 1.5 pineapples, 1 3/4 pineapples, two pineapples, 2.5, 2 3/4. But once you get to one radio for 3 pineapples, Kenya's going to be like, no, that's not a good trade for us. It's not a good trade for Kenya. They would rather have it closer to a lower, like a one radio for like 1.5 or 1 1/4 pineapples, where India would rather get one radio closer to 3. So India would rather have a trade closer to the 3, where Kenya would rather have the one radio closer to the one pineapple. But I chose two. It was right smack dab in the middle. They should both be pretty fair off with that trade. Okay. So, like I said, one radio for two pineapples makes them both better off. Okay, that's a good deal for both. Okay, um, if you know, it's a good trade. Okay, that would be that ratio would be good. Okay, so let's take a look at this example here. This is question 32 from 2008. It says, before specializing in trade, the domestic opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of grain in alpha and in beta is which of the following? So here we have two different alpha and beta, and they're on the same graph, right? They're on the same graph here, and it's asking for 1 ton of grain. 1 ton of grain. So they're asking, what does it cost alpha for one grain? What is their opportunity cost for one grain? And beta for one grain, right? They're asking what's their opportunity cost. So this is output data. So output data would say other over. So for alpha to make one grain, 30 over 30. So to make one grain, their cost is 1 ton of steel. And for beta, other over, so that'd be 20 over 10. That would be for one grain, that would be 20 over 10, which would be 2 steel. All right, which would be 2 steel. And that should get you the answer B. That should get you the answer B. Using the same one here, it says the theory of comparative advantage implies that alpha would find it advantageous to. So that's going to ask, it's essentially asking you to calculate the comparative advantage to see what alpha should do. So we already said alpha, for alpha, 1 ton of grain is 1 ton of steel. For one steel, it's 1 ton of grain. And then for beta, and I'll write beta down here in the corner, we said for beta, one grain was equal to 2 steels. And then the reciprocal for that for one steel would be 1/2 grain, right? So it's asking essentially who has comparative advantage. So when we compare grains, who has comparative advantage in grains? Well, it looks like alpha is better at making grain, right? Then it says who's better at making steel, and that would be beta. Beta is better at making steel. So if if alpha's better at making grain, he would export grain and he would import steel. Where then beta would be better off at exporting. I'm just going to put ES, export steel, and import grain. Now, given that information, we would have to then calculate what the answer would be up here. So the answer would be then what would be best for alpha? Alpha, we said export grain, import steel, and that's A. Okay. Then I believe the next question says, what would be a good trade ratio? Number 34, it asks what would be a good trade ratio. So it's giving us some trade ratios. So I'm going to go back to where our data is, and because you're going to draw all over this on the test, and it's all doing it in grain. So if we did, I'll choose a different color. Let's choose this green. So if we're going to do one grain, we know it has to either be between one steel, greater than one steel, but less than two steels. So anything between one and two steels would be good for us. So let's take a look. Anything between one and two. Well, the only one for that is B because that's at 1.5. So that's where you'd be for that one. Okay. Going through a lot of examples here because we need to practice. Okay. So here, once again, they're giving you the coordinates here. 24002. So this is what they're doing here for country A and country B. So essentially for country A, it's looking like this. If this is computers, I'll use C is 24, and I'll use K for cars is 12 here. That's essentially what they're doing in this example here. And for B, they're doing this. They're doing cars at 45 here, and sorry, computers at 45, and cars then uh, uh, cars at 15. Okay, so that's essentially what they're doing here. It says they're producing computers and cars with equal amounts of resources and employment. So, given this information, it's asking who has, it says, which of the following is true. So, we know if we think just about comparative advantage and absolute advantage, we know that B has, he produces about absolute advantage, he produces 45, he produces 24. He has absolute advantage here, and we know that B has absolute advantage here. So essentially, B has absolute advantage in both, right? Um, then it says it wants to calculate. This is output data, so this is 000. So to make one computer other over would be one half of a car. To make one car would be two computers, and then for firm B to make one car other over, that would be 1/3 of a computer, and to make or I'm sorry, yeah, one computer would be 1/3 of a car. For one car other over would be three computers. So if we know absolute advantage, B has absolute advantage in both. And then what is B also? Let's see. A, let's see. B has comparative advantage in computers, and A has comparative advantage in cars. So if we go through and we look at the answers, we would get B. All right. So there's some work involved here. All right. There's plenty of work that's involved, but we have to practice these. Okay. So let's go ahead. If you want to pause and let you guys kind of figure this out yourself. It says if two nations specialize according to the law of comparative advantage and then trade with each other, which of the following statements is true? So if you want to pause, take a look. All right, you should have came out with E, that each nation would increase its consumption possibilities if they both specialize in trade, and it's a good trade amount. If it's a good amount of trade, then they would be both better off. Let's look at this one's from 2018. Once again, you have two different. It says this diagram shows production possibility curves of two countries, Artland and Rayland, using equal amounts of resources they can produce. So this is production. This is output. This is output. Once again, this is output. So you have 1,200 and 300, 600 and 300. Right. So no one has absolute advantage in bicycles, but we see Rayland has absolute advantage in hats. But once again, we don't use absolute advantage to determine which one has the comparative advantage. So this is like an FRQ. This is just your typical FRQ that you would go through. So it says calculate the so A says calculate the opportunity cost of bicycles. So this is exactly what an FRQ would be. Okay, FRQ. Okay, and you're going to have three of them on the AP College board. You're going to have one long and two short. This would be an equivalent to a short one. This is calculate the opportunity cost. So what we'll do is we'll put Rayland up here, and we know for them to make one hat, all right, and this is output data, other overs. So 300 over 1200 is like 3 over 12, right? Which is 1/4, right, of a bicycle. Then to make one bicycle is equal to 4 hats. So that's Raylan. And then I'll put Artland over here. Artland is to make one hat. Other over, so 300 over that, 300 over 600 would be 1/2 of a bicycle. And to make one bicycle is equal to um, 2 hats. Okay. So when it says here, now they would give you spots on the test to answer all these like blank pieces of paper, sort of, and so you'd have to do all the math and label things inside of it. So it says calculate the opportunity cost of a bicycle for Artland, and Artland was here on the right. So for Artland to make one bicycle, they'd have to give up 2 hats. So you'd show the math here. Then it says if the two countries specialize in trade, will which country will import bicycles? Explain. So I'm going to use a different color here. So it says which country will import bicycles? Explain. So you would have to go through and so first of all, let's compare bicycles to bicycles. Who's better at making bicycles? Who gives up the least? Rayland, it costs him 4 hats, where it costs 2 hats for Artland. So Artland will be making bicycles, and Rayland will be making hats. So he's going to export. He's going to export bikes, and he's going to import hats. And over here, he's going to export hats, and import bicycles. Okay. So given that, then it says if the two countries specialize in trade, which country will import bicycles? Well, we would say that in your answer, and it says explain, so you have to be detailed. You would have to say that Rayland would import bicycles because he has comparative advantage in hats, because it cost him to make one hat, it cost him 1/4 of a bicycle, which is less than Artland's, where it costs for one hat, it costs him 1/2 of a bicycle. So it's cheaper so you have to clearly identify that it's cheaper for Rayland to make hats. Therefore, he's going to import bicycles. And he's going to import bicycles because Artland is better at making bicycles. So you have to clearly state that. Okay. So if the term of trade were 5 hats for one bicycle, would the trade be advantageous for each of the following? So if it said one bicycle for 5 hats, well, let's see. Well, for one bicycle for 5 hats, for Artland, since he's going to specialize in those, that's awesome for him. That's awesome for him. He would love that trade, right? Artland would like it. I'm going to put a little heart here. He would love that trade. Artland would love that trade because he's making a lot. But would Raylan like that? Heck no, because why would he trade for 5 hats? It cost him 4 hats to make a bike. Why would he have to want to make 5? It would be cheaper. He'd be like, no way. It would be cheaper for him to make his own hats, because here the trade is costing him 5 hats for one bike, where on his own, it only costs him 4 hats to make a bike. Okay. All right. So then it says if production in Artland triples, uh, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of hats? If he tripled, if if he tripled his production, if Artland triples his production, he goes from 300 to 900 and from 600 to 1800. His ratio would stay the same, and they would still follow the same trade. They would still specialize. Uh, Artland would still specialize in bicycles, and Raylan would still specialize in hats because the comparative advantage doesn't change if you just triple the numbers. Okay. Whew, that one was a lot. That one was a lot. Okay. So once again, the next ones I'm going to ask you that you take a look here. You would have to, in class, what we would do is ask you to create a graph, kind of show who has comparative advantage, who has absolute advantage. With these right here, this is something we would normally do in class on the whiteboard. So Sarah gives 2 haircuts or 1 perm in an hour. Megan could give 3 haircuts or 2 perms in an hour. So who has absolute advantage, who has comparative advantage? So if you want to take the time and pause this and practice and go through that. But I'm going to keep going to some other practices here so we can get through because there's quite a few more to do here. And this video is getting long. Some more practice, input or output, number caught per day, right? So deer and antelope, John and Henry, right? This and then we have months to produce. So number caught per day, this would be output. Number months of producing, that would be input. And then acres to produce 100 bushels, that too would be input. Okay. So if we go through, is there an absolute advantage? Do we have an absolute advantage? So if this is output, absolute advantage, oops, I'm sorry. Absolute advantage, we'd say if this is output, we would say that deer John is better, antelopes are better. If it's input, it's actually the lesser number that has absolute advantage. So this would be Canada would have absolute advantage in cars and in planes. And then this is also input. So the lesser of them would be here. This would be John and both. They'd have absolute advantage in those. So now if we go ahead and we're going to calculate opportunity costs. So we're using output other over. So if we calculated that, we would get 1 deer is equal to 2/3 of an antelope. 1 antelope would be 2/3 of a deer. For John here, 1 deer is 1/2 of an antelope. 1 antelope is equal to 2 deer. Okay, so we would see who has comparative advantage, and if we look here, who gives up the least, we can see that John gives up the least in deer, and Henry the least in antelope. So if they were going to specialize in trade, John should just hunt deer, and Henry should just hunt antelope. Um, So that's where we'd be there. The next one here, once again, other, or no, I'm sorry, this is IOU, this is input. So it'd be input other under. So if we were calculating one for one car, it would be other unders. So 10 or 8 over 10. So 10, bring that 10 under, that's 4/5. And here, if we we're going to do one plane, other under, so 10 over 8, that's 5/4. So now we do the same thing here for Japan, who has comparative advantage here. 4/5 is less than 5/4. So we would get Canada would have comparative advantage here, and therefore Japan would have comparative advantage here. If we look down here now on bushels, acres to produce 100 bushels. So Henry, 9 acres for corn, 8 acres for John for corn, and then 3 and 2. So if we're going to calculate this, it's input, so other under. So if we want to make 1 corn, 9 divided by 3 is 3, and then we get 1/3 over here. So we'd end up with this. The 1 corn is 3 rice, 1 corn is 4 rice for John, and then we would look at the comparative advantage, and we'd see Henry should be making rice or corn, I'm sorry, and John should be making rice. If it was going to be, if we were going to come up with some sort of trade, we could say one rice has to be greater than 1/4 corn, but less than 1/3. So there's not much of a margin there. This has a little bit bigger numbers, so it'd have to be greater than, if we did for trading for corn, one corn, it would have to be greater than 3, but less than 4. So one corn for, let's say, 3.5 rices, and that would be a positive trade for both. Okay. So once again, this is we're looking at possibilities of what we can do. How we can trade. What is the best thing for us? Without trade, here Tom can only, he can consume anything on his production possibility frontier. He can make 30 coconuts or 40 fish or any combination. So right here he's making 28.9. So this is right there on the line. So that's right there. Can he be out here? He could if he specialized and traded with someone. Here is Hank. All right, we got Tom and Hank. Tom Hanks. So we have Hank can do 20 coconuts or 10 fish, and let's say he splits his time between the two, and now he's able to consume or produce and consume 8 coconuts and 6 fish. But if they specialize and trade, right? So if we calculate their opportunity costs, we specialize in trade for one fish. Tom, it costs him 3/4 of a coconut. It costs Hanks 2 coconuts. For one coconut, it costs Tom 4/3 of a fish, or it costs Hanks 1/2 of a fish. So if we do this and we go ahead and we look and who should specialize in trade, if we compare the two, for one fish, Tom should be making fish, Tom should be focused on fish, and Hank should be focused on coconuts, because we look at, for coconuts, he's only giving up a half, where he's giving up 4/3. So Hank should be focusing on coconuts, and Tom should be focused on fish. So they're both better off if they specialize. So if Tom focuses on fishing and Hanks focuses on coconuts, then realistically they can. Ooh, why is this all jacked up? They can trade and be outside of the production possibility curve. Okay. Whoa. They can be outside the production possibility curve. And this just goes through the examples of if they were to trade, right? If they were to trade. So here they were essentially trading here. He was producing 40 here and 20 here. And then they specialized in trade. So they're essentially trading 10 for 10. And so they're essentially, they're better off when they specialize in trade. I'm sorry, this is just starting to run a little bit farther. They're both better off with trade. This is not as good of an example as what I showed you before. Okay, so international trade uses comparative advantage. Whether a country focuses on pork or aircrafts or military weapons or corn or soybean or finished electronics. We want to be able to trade. And here's an example of if we specialize in trade, if they produce where they should be. And in this example, aircrafts versus pork. If the United States produced all pork and Canada produced all aircrafts and specialized in trade, and the trade ratio is a good number, they both can be outside of the production possibility frontier. But if you can see, this trade ratio actually has the United States doing better off, right? See how much further out it is of the production possibility frontier, where Canada's really close. This is one of the negotiations that Canada would try to figure out a way to get a little further out if they could. Okay. So in summary, and I know this is a long video, you need to practice comparative advantage, go through, practice those problems at the end of the packet, the worksheets for module 4. Please try them. I will make a video and post those online shortly. All right. So thank you. Have a great day, and we will talk to you all later. Goodbye.